Under the burning Arizona sun, a small German shepherd puppy lay half buried in the sand, trapped inside a twisted metal crate. No one stopped. Cars passed. The air shimmered. It was 115 degrees, and that little soul had been left to die. Someone whispered, "Don't look. It's already gone." But one man did look back. His name was Raymond Cole, 55, a veteran who had stopped believing in mercy. He'd seen too much death to care again. But that day, the desert tested him. When he turned to leave, the puppy didn't cry. It didn't even whimper. It just lay there, eyes open, chest trembling against the heat. He drove away. The world fell silent, the kind of silence that breaks men who once survived wars. And somewhere between guilt and dust, he turned the wheel around. That's where it began, when a broken soldier crossed paths with a creature more stubborn than death itself. Before we begin, take a deep breath. Ask yourself, if it were you driving that road, would you have stopped? If stories of courage and compassion still mean something to you, like they do to me, hit like, share, and subscribe. And tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Because I truly want to know how far this story can travel. The afternoon sun above Arizona burned the sky until it looked like hammered brass. Heat shimmered off the asphalt in long, wavering ribbons that seemed to float between earth and air. The wind, dry and sharp, roared through the canyons and carried the scent of metal and dust. Crows circled over a highway that stretched without mercy, straight, endless, and cruelly bright. A rusted blue Ford moved through that emptiness, its engine coughing in rhythm with the heart of a man who no longer counted the miles he drove. Raymond Cole, 55, sat behind the wheel, his shoulders squared but tired, his face tanned to the color of old parchment. Deep lines framed his mouth, and his eyes, gray, steady, and distant, looked not at the road, but through it. The sleeves of his faded military jacket were rolled to the elbows, revealing wrists marked by the faint scars of old service and newer solitude. Inside the truck, the air smelled of sun-baked leather and gasoline. The dashboard rattled like loose bones each time the tires struck another patch of cracked earth. He kept the window half open, letting the wind sear his face like fire. It was punishment and relief all at once. He didn't listen to the radio anymore. The silence was easier. He had once been a man of discipline, of clear orders and certain faith. But wars didn't end when the bullets stopped. They just changed their scenery. Now the battlefield was quiet. His own mind, his empty house, the stretch of highway where no one called his name. Then it happened. The kind of moment that doesn't look like much, but ends up changing everything. At first, it was only a flicker at the edge of his sight, a glint of metal in the dust, something small beside the road. He almost passed it, assuming it was just scrap or trash, the kind that heat turns silver. But something in him, a soldier's reflex maybe, or the ghost of conscience, made him slow down. The truck rolled to a stop. The engine idled, coughing heat. Raymond leaned forward, squinting past the blur of sunlight, and saw it clearly now. A small metal crate tipped halfway on its side. The paint scorched away. The bars rusted. Inside, something moved. So faintly he thought at first it was a trick of the light. He stepped out. The soles of his boots sank slightly into the powdery dirt. The sound of cicadas filled the air, 1,000 dry wings rattling in chorus. The wind slapped his jacket against his ribs as he walked toward the cage. Inside, a German shepherd puppy, no more than 4 or 5 months old, lay curled against the corner. Its fur, once golden brown, was now matted with dirt and sweat. Foam crusted its mouth. The ribs showed stark under the skin like fragile wires beneath a sheet of dust. One eye flickered open at his shadow, then closed again. The chest rose, barely, and fell, as though the desert itself were breathing for it. Raymond froze. He had seen bodies in worse states, faces turned to stone by heat and fear. But this one wasn't dead. Not yet. The wind picked up, tossing grit against his boots. He looked around. No tracks, no vehicle, no sign of whoever had left it here. Just that small, silent creature. Waiting. Not crying, not begging, only waiting. Something twisted inside him. For a moment he felt the old instinct surge. Assess. Act. Protect. His hand even reached out toward the latch. Then he stopped. The world had taught him what compassion cost. Every time he'd reached out before, something had broken. He stared at the pup, jaw tight, the heat shimmering around them both like a veil between mercy and survival. His voice came out hoarse, almost like a growl. "You shouldn't have trusted anyone out here," he muttered. The words were meant for the dog, but they tasted like truth aimed back at himself. He turned away. The sound of the door slamming echoed across the desert like a gunshot. The truck roared to life, trembling as if it didn't want to leave either. But Raymond forced it forward, dust trailing behind in long, dying plumes. In his mirror, the crate grew smaller, then disappeared. For a few miles, he convinced himself it was fine. Someone else would find it. The desert swallowed things all the time. It was merciful that way. He told himself he wasn't the man for this, not anymore. Saving things only led to losing them again. But mile after mile, the silence began to speak. Every gust of wind sounded like the rasping breath he'd left behind. The glint of every beer can in the ditch looked like the shimmer off the cage. Even the smell of hot oil seemed to carry a memory of the sand and the sound of something trying not to die. He drove faster, as if speed could drown the thoughts. The odometer needle quivered near 90. The land blurred into the color of rust and bone. When the sun began to drop, the horizon turned into a line of fire, and shadows stretched across the road like reaching hands. He pulled over by a rest stop, a place so forgotten that even the vending machine had given up. He shut off the engine. For a long time, he just sat there. His reflection stared back from the cracked windshield, eyes hollow and rimmed red. He remembered other nights, dust storms in Kandahar, the faces of men he couldn't save, the way he'd sworn never to feel that kind of helplessness again. But here it was, gnawing at the edge of him, shaped like a dying dog. He leaned back, closing his eyes. But sleep never came. The desert had a way of keeping its witnesses awake. When darkness finally fell, it was total. No moon. Only the pale wash of stars and the whisper of heat dying off the land. Coyotes howled in the distance, their voices carrying across the dry ravines like echoes of a world that still remembered how to care. In his dream, the crate returned. It wasn't on the road anymore. It was burning. Flames rose high, red against the black sky, and through them he saw those same eyes looking up at him, unblinking. The sound wasn't barking. It was the sound of something forgiving him. He woke before dawn, the steering wheel cold under his hands. His throat was dry, his heart pounding with the weight of something that had no name. The sky in the east was turning the color of ash, a faint silver line against the dying night. A single thought cut through everything, clear, simple, impossible to ignore. He started the engine. The Ford coughed once, then settled into a steady rumble. Dust rose behind him as he turned the truck around, headlights carving a pale road through the dark. The horizon was beginning to glow, a band of gold waiting at the edge of the world. When dawn came, he was already driving back toward the sun. Before dawn, the desert held its breath. The wind had stopped whispering, and the world waited in the kind of silence that comes before either mercy or death. Frost clung to the rims of the stones, and the air tasted like iron. Raymond's truck cut through that stillness, its headlights flickering over the dirt road, painting the horizon with two pale scars of light. The horizon bled faint gold, and in the distance, the shape of the crate emerged again, half buried in sand, edges gleaming faintly in the cold. He stepped out, breath curling into the dim air, boots crunching over gravel. The ground was hard, sharp enough to bite through the thin fabric of his jeans as he knelt. The smell reached him first, a mix of rust, dried blood, and something like surrender. The crate's bars were damp with dew, the latch eaten by corrosion. Inside, the puppy lay curled tightly against the corner, its fur caked with sand, each breath a shallow tremor against the cold metal. Raymond reached through the bars, his fingers stiff from the chill. He expected stillness, something quiet and finished. But the fur beneath his hand twitched. Not much, just a faint shiver, the fragile insistence of a body that refused to quit. He froze, his heart thudding once, then again, a sound he hadn't felt inside his chest in far too long. "You're still fighting," he muttered under his breath, though the desert was the only one listening. The pup tried to move, a small, broken sound scraping out from its chest. It was not a whine, not even a plea, just defiance. A dry, rasping growl that spoke of hunger, thirst, and the sheer will to stay. Raymond's jaw tightened. There was something too familiar in that sound, the same stubborn pulse that had kept him alive through nights when he didn't want to be. He drew his hand back slowly, as if not to break whatever fragile thread still tethered the creature to the world. He reached into the truck and came back with a small canteen. Kneeling again, he unscrewed the cap and poured a thin line of water into the sand beside the crate. It darkened instantly, vanishing beneath the dust. The pup's nose twitched toward it, but it didn't move. Its tongue was cracked, dry, useless. Raymond waited. The sun edged higher, and the frost began to melt off the rocks, leaving streaks of silver that quickly turned to heat. Minutes blurred into hours. He sat there, back against the fender of his truck, watching the light crawl across the land. Sweat darkened the back of his shirt, salt stinging the old scars that webbed his shoulders. He didn't move. The old training had taught him patience. Wait, endure, outlast the pain. But this felt different. This wasn't about tactics or survival. This was something quieter, something that demanded no orders and offered no reward. By the time the sun had climbed to its cruelest height, the air shimmered again. Heat rose from the asphalt like smoke. The puppy had stopped making sounds. It just breathed, thin, unsteady, but alive. Raymond's lips were dry, his throat aching, yet he stayed. Somewhere deep down, the same part of him that once refused to leave a fallen comrade whispered, "Don't move yet." Then, out of nowhere, a sound broke the silence. A low, growing rumble. At first he thought it was thunder rolling across the desert, but there were no clouds, only light. The vibration deepened, metal grinding against rock, and then the roar came. A black pickup truck hurtling down the highway, weaving across lanes like something possessed. Raymond's body reacted before his mind did. He lunged forward, boots digging into the dirt, his hands gripping the edges of the crate. The wind from the oncoming vehicle slapped his face, full of dust and heat. In that split second, instinct returned in full. The same adrenaline that once made him sprint into fire, drag men from wreckage, patch wounds under screaming skies. He pulled hard, dragging the crate sideways, the metal screeching against the gravel. The truck thundered past, close enough for him to feel the rush of air and the sting of flying debris. The edge of the bumper grazed his shoulder, spinning him half around. Gravel cut into his palms as he fell, but he didn't let go. The roar faded into distance, leaving only the echo of his heartbeat pounding through the silence. For a long moment, he didn't move. Dust hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. His shoulder throbbed, blood seeping through a shallow tear in his sleeve. Then he looked down. The crate was dented, its bars twisted slightly from the force but still whole. Inside, the puppy's sides rose and fell with a faint rhythm, fragile but steady. He exhaled slowly, wiping his forehead with the back of his wrist. The taste of blood and dust mingled on his tongue. The adrenaline drained, leaving behind a heavy stillness, the kind that feels like grace in disguise. He sat there, listening to the faint rasp of the pup's breath, the endless hum of wind returning over the flats. Raymond reached down again, this time more certain. His hands, still shaking, found the latch and pulled. The metal groaned, reluctant, but finally gave way. The door creaked open. Inside, the pup shifted its head toward the sound, its ears twitching weakly. Raymond lifted it gently, his palms sliding under the frail ribs, feeling each bone move beneath the thin layer of skin and fur. The weight was almost nothing, barely 5 pounds of bone, dust, and courage. The pup's head lolled against his arm, breath catching in short bursts. Raymond stared at it for a long time, the heat pressing down, the world reduced to the two of them and the whisper of survival. A soft sound escaped him, somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. "You're one stubborn soul," he murmured, voice low, almost reverent. Then, after a beat, softer still, as if to himself, "Guess we're both cursed to survive." He stood, the puppy cradled in his arms, the road stretching ahead like a promise he didn't yet understand. The desert wind rose again, carrying the scent of rust and dust and the faint, undeniable pulse of something reborn. The town appeared on the horizon like a mirage, faded rooftops, rusted gas pumps, the hint of a water tower barely standing against the glare. Raymond's truck rattled down the main street, engine whining, the smell of gasoline sharp and constant. The pup lay wrapped in his jacket on the passenger seat, its head lolling with every bump, fur damp and matted against his arm. He pressed harder on the accelerator, the needle trembling as if counting heartbeats. Every breath the dog took was a question that might not be answered. He spotted the sign just as the sun began to dip. Carver Veterinary Clinic. A low brick building with a white door and the paint peeling off its edges. The neon open sign flickered weakly, its last letter dying in the orange light. Raymond pulled up too fast, tires scraping the curb, and stumbled out with the puppy in his arms. His shirt was soaked through, streaked with sweat and blood. The smell of oil and heat followed him as he pushed through the door. Inside, the air was cold and sterile. A fluorescent light buzzed overhead, flickering with the kind of tired rhythm that made every shadow seem alive. Behind the front desk sat a young woman, mid-20s, thin-framed, blonde hair tied too tight, chewing gum like it was the only thing keeping her awake. She looked up from her phone, eyes widening at the sight of him, her nose wrinkled. "We're closed," she said flatly, as if reciting something she'd said too many times before. The words hit him harder than the desert sun. For a second, Raymond just stood there, breathing hard, the room spinning slightly. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His hands tightened around the bundle in his arms. The pup made a weak sound, half sigh, half growl, and its head drooped against his wrist. Before he could speak, a voice came from the hallway behind her. "Let him in!" The man who stepped out wore green scrubs faded by time and bleach. His hair was more silver than gray, combed neatly, though it didn't stay that way. Lines etched deep around his eyes, the kind that come not from laughter, but from seeing too much of what breaks. Dr. Aris, maybe in his late 60s, moved with the quiet precision of someone who had been doing this for a lifetime. His gaze met Raymond's, steady and calm. Without another word, he walked forward, extending his arms. Raymond hesitated for a breath, then handed over the small, trembling weight. The old man cradled the pup against his chest, scanning it quickly, checking the eyes, the gums, the pulse at the base of the neck. "We'll take it from here," he said softly, already turning down the hall. The door swung shut behind him. Raymond stood frozen, jacket still damp in his hands. The hum of the fluorescent lights filled the room, and somewhere beyond the wall came the muted clang of metal trays and the rush of running water. The receptionist didn't look up again. She just went back to her phone, her expression unreadable, as if the moment had never happened. He found a chair by the wall and sat down heavily. The exhaustion hit all at once, crawling through his bones. His hands were shaking. Blood, his own or the dog's, had dried in thin brown lines along his knuckles. He stared at them, then at the empty space in his lap, and felt something hollow settle deep inside. Time became a blur. The light outside the window turned from gold to gray to black. Somewhere down the corridor, machines beeped in slow, uncertain rhythms. Once, he thought he heard the doctor's voice, calm but urgent, giving instructions. He couldn't make out the words. He didn't want to. All he could do was sit and listen, to the hum, to his heartbeat, to the sound of hope hanging by a thread. At some point, the receptionist left, turning off the front lights without saying a word. The waiting room dimmed to a half shadow, the kind of darkness that makes you realize how long you've been holding your breath. Raymond leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor until the patterns in the tiles began to shift. He didn't move when the door finally creaked open again. Dr. Aris stood there, shoulders slumped, gloves stained with the faint brown of old blood. His face was unreadable in the low light, but his eyes held something steady. "He's alive," he said quietly. Then, after a pause that lasted longer than any heartbeat, "Barely." The words landed somewhere between a blessing and a punishment. Raymond's throat tightened, though no sound came. He didn't cry. He just sat there, blinking once, twice, then not at all. His chest ached from the sudden, unbearable relief. Dr. Aris rested a hand briefly on his shoulder before walking past him, heading toward the back again. The faint scent of antiseptic trailed after him, sharp and clean, cutting through the heavy air. Raymond watched the hallway for a long time after he was gone, as if the man might come back with a different ending. When morning came, pale light slid through the blinds, dust motes drifting like slow snow in the air. Raymond was still there, sitting where he'd fallen asleep. His back hurt, his neck stiff, but he didn't care. The sound of a mop dragging on tile pulled him from his thoughts. Dr. Aris had returned, wearing the same faded scrubs, his hair a little messier, eyes red-rimmed but awake. He stopped when he saw Raymond holding the mop, pushing it across the floor. The old man raised an eyebrow. "You don't have to do that," he said, voice rough with fatigue. Raymond didn't look up. His movements were steady, deliberate, like he'd been doing it all his life. "You saved him," he said finally, his tone low but certain. "Let me do something worth staying for." Dr. Aris stood there a moment longer, studying him, then nodded once, slowly, as if understanding the language of men who'd run out of words. Without another comment, he turned away, disappearing again down the hall. Raymond kept mopping, the faint hum of the machines in the next room blending with the quiet rhythm of his breathing. The morning sun crept higher, spilling through the window in long, trembling lines, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to leave. Morning began the same way every day. The clatter of metal bowls, the squeak of rubber boots on tile, the smell of antiseptic tangled with hay and fur. Raymond rose before the sun, brewed coffee too strong for anyone else, and stepped into the rhythm of the clinic as if it were a hymn he didn't know he remembered. The air was cool inside, heavy with the scent of bleach and medicine, and his reflection followed him across the glass doors. A man still learning how to exist quietly. He worked without being asked. He hosed down kennels until the water turned from brown to clear, scrubbed stainless steel tables until they shone like mirrors, carried feed bags twice his weight without complaint. Each motion felt less like labor and more like confession, a way to balance the invisible scales between what he'd lost and what he was beginning to find again. Sometimes Dr. Aris would pass by, nodding once without a word, his eyes calm but knowing. They understood each other in silence. The clinic didn't just heal animals, it collected the broken who had forgotten how. The days blurred together. The radio in the front office played softly, country songs about roads and rain that nobody listened to. The young receptionist, now warmer than before, sometimes left a cup of water for him near the sink, though he rarely drank it. The light shifted across the walls as hours passed, tracing gold lines across the cages, then fading into dusk. In that rhythm, Raymond found something he hadn't felt in years, a purpose that didn't demand glory, only endurance. And in one of those cages, near the far wall, the little German shepherd was learning to breathe again. His leg was bound in a thin cast, his ribs still sharp under the fur, but his eyes, clear now, amber and watchful, had begun to follow movement again. The clinic staff had started calling him Max, short and strong, like the sound of hope spoken too quickly. Raymond never said it out loud, but the name fit. There was something in the pup's gaze, a kind of quiet defiance that refused to fade even when pain lingered in every breath. Max didn't trust anyone. When a vet tech approached with food, he'd turn his head away, pressing into the far corner of the pen. When someone tried to pet him, he'd freeze, muscles trembling, eyes distant. But when Raymond passed, the pup would shift, watching him through the wire, silent but awake. The first time it happened, Raymond almost didn't notice. The second time he did, and by the third, he found himself pausing just long enough to nod in acknowledgement, the way soldiers used to do on long, wordless nights. Days turned to weeks. The cast was changed. Fur grew back where it had burned away, and the clinic began to smell less like antiseptic and more like living things again. Raymond's hands, once clumsy, moved with care now. He'd learned how to rinse gauze, how to steady an IV pole, how to speak softly around fear. Sometimes he'd catch Dr. Aris watching him from the doorway, the ghost of a smile on the old man's face, as if he recognized that healing didn't always come from medicine. One afternoon, after the last appointment ended and the front lights dimmed, Raymond swept the floor in slow arcs. The mop glided across the tiles, catching bits of straw and dust, leaving behind thin streaks that gleamed under the fading light. The building had grown quiet, the kind of silence that only happens when everyone has gone home, but one heart hasn't yet learned how to stop waiting. He passed Max's pen on his way to the supply closet. The pup lifted his head from the blanket, eyes catching the last light of day, and for a moment, their gazes locked. Raymond hesitated. He could see the faint tremor in the dog's flank, the slow rise and fall of breath that still carried strain. The wire between them gleamed faintly, thin as the space between two lives that didn't yet know how to trust again. Max shifted, his nose pressing against the gap in the wire. The movement was small, almost uncertain. Raymond froze, every instinct telling him to let the moment pass, to avoid breaking something fragile. But then his hand moved, slow and deliberate, lowering until his fingertips brushed the cool metal. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The air between them felt electric, heavy with the kind of quiet that only exists before forgiveness. Then, softly, Max leaned forward and touched his nose to the man's hand. A heartbeat later, a single, trembling lick brushed against Raymond's fingers, quick, hesitant, but real. It was nothing. It was everything. Raymond's breath caught. The sound of the mop falling to the floor barely reached his ears. He stood there, staring at the pup whose ribs still showed and whose tail now gave one slow, uncertain thump against the blanket. Something deep in his chest, something rusted, sealed, and forgotten, shifted. He didn't even realize he was smiling until the muscles in his face ached from the unfamiliar motion. For years, he had worn his silence like armor, believing that care was weakness and kindness was a risk. But in that moment, with a scarred hand pressed to cold wire and a half-healed pup resting against it, he understood that survival alone wasn't living. The clinic lights flickered once, then steadied. The night outside was blue and soft, carrying the smell of rain that hadn't yet fallen. Raymond knelt by the pen, his eyes level with the dog's, voice low, the kind that carried farther than shouting ever could. "Maybe we both still remember how to live," he whispered. And for the first time since the desert, he believed it. The days had softened. For the first time in years, Raymond's mornings began not with silence, but with sound. Claws tapping against tile, bowls clinking, a bark that carried a kind of reckless joy. Max had grown stronger. His coat now shimmered bronze beneath the clinic's thin sunlight, and his once shaky steps had turned into steady trots across the corridor. The scar on his leg was still visible beneath the fur, but it no longer defined him. He barked at mop handles, chased shadows, and brought his own kind of warmth to the sterile place that had once smelled only of bleach and regret. Dr. Aris often watched from the doorway, the faintest smile beneath his tired eyes. "He likes you," he'd said once, though it was less an observation than a quiet confession. Raymond had only shrugged. "We just survived the same storm," he'd answered. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. Max didn't just trust him. He mirrored him. Each day the dog found more strength. Raymond felt something unspoken inside himself thaw a little more. And yet peace never stays long for soldiers. It began one evening when the clinic lights hummed softly and the air smelled of rain. Raymond noticed Max's bowl untouched. The dog lay still in his pen, sides rising too fast, eyes glassy and distant. His ears flicked weakly when Raymond knelt beside him. "Hey," he said, voice low, steady. Not tonight, huh? But there was no bark, no tail thump, just the sound of shallow breath scraping in and out like sand through broken glass. He called for Aris. The doctor arrived within seconds, his face already shifting from calm to concern. Temperature's up, he murmured, pressing his stethoscope to Max's chest. Breathing's too fast. He checked the gums, the pulse, then frowned. Sepsis, maybe. The infection spread. His voice was low, practiced, but his eyes betrayed him. They had seen too many creatures lose this kind of fight. Raymond stepped back as the room transformed. Aris moved with quiet urgency. IV line, saline drip, antibiotics, a small oxygen mask fitted over the dog's muzzle. The young receptionist returned, hair loose now, her face pale beneath the fluorescent light. She handed tools, fetched syringes, and then fell silent when the monitor began to slow its rhythm. The beeps, steady at first, grew faint, stretched thin across the air like dying breaths. Raymond gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. He could smell the metallic tang of disinfectant, feel the heat radiating from the pup's small body. He's fading, Aris said softly. We're losing him. Something old ignited in Raymond then. The same fire that had dragged him across deserts and out of wreckage. The stubborn refusal to accept that a heartbeat could stop while he still had one left. He pushed forward, placing his hand over Max's chest. No, he said quietly, his voice low and raw. You fought the desert. You fight this too. Aris didn't stop him. The doctor just stepped aside, watching with the weary understanding of someone who had long since learned that sometimes medicine wasn't the whole fight. The room fell silent except for the hum of the machines, the ticking of the clock on the wall, and Raymond's whispers cutting through the darkness like thread. Hours passed. Sweat gathered at his temples, rolling down through the dust on his cheeks. He never lifted his hand. He stayed that way, bent over the table, murmuring words that only the broken ever understand. Sometimes he told stories from the war, not out loud, but in his head, men he'd held the same way, whose pulses had faded beneath his palms. But this one, he swore, this one wasn't going. The fever burned through the night. Max's body trembled, his paws twitching, his breath ragged. Aris adjusted the IV, changed the fluids, wiped the dog's muzzle. Each time he moved, Raymond muttered something, a promise, a prayer, a command. The lines between them blurred until the man and the animal seemed one single will refusing to yield. Outside, the rain began to fall, slow and deliberate, like the desert finally remembering how to weep. The world shrank to that small room, the steady dim light, the hum of the oxygen machine, the faint smell of hope and blood. Then, somewhere close to dawn, the rhythm changed. It started as a flicker beneath Raymond's hand, a tiny pulse, fragile and uneven. He froze, afraid to believe it. Then it came again, stronger, spreading from his palm to his arm like warmth through frozen skin. The fever had broken. The heartbeat had found its rhythm again. Steady, insistent, alive. Aris looked up, eyes wide, voice hoarse. He's through, he said. He made it. Raymond didn't answer. His head dropped forward, shoulders trembling. He stayed there, one hand still pressed against the small rise and fall of Max's chest. The dog let out a faint sound. Not quite a bark. Not quite a sigh. Just the quiet exhale of a life that refused to stop breathing. Tears carved thin paths down Raymond's face, cutting through dust and exhaustion. For the first time in years, he didn't hide them. They came slow, almost grateful, leaving salt on his lips and the taste of something real. The night had stripped him bare, and what remained wasn't the soldier or the wanderer. It was simply a man who had stopped running long enough to feel again. The light of morning crept through the blinds, soft and golden, touching everything it could reach. Raymond brushed the damp fur from Max's forehead, his voice breaking as he whispered, "You came back." A faint smile flickered through the tears, small and weary but true. "Guess we're both done running." And for once, there was no echo in the room, only breath and the sound of two hearts remembering how to keep time. Morning light poured through the narrow clinic windows, spilling gold across the tile floors. Dust floated in the air like quiet applause, marking time in a place that had learned how to breathe again. Raymond wiped down the last counter, his movements slow and deliberate. The mop bucket beside him filled with clear water for once. Behind the partition, he could hear Max barking, bright, impatient, full of energy that no longer trembled with fear. Weeks had passed since that night. The fever, the trembling, the scent of metal and blood, all had given way to mornings like this, clean, calm, almost ordinary. Max's coat gleamed now, every movement quick and alive, his tail a metronome of life rediscovered. Sometimes when Raymond caught his reflection in the polished kennels, he almost didn't recognize himself. The hollow in his face had softened, and his eyes, once dulled by desert and memory, had learned to rest again. "Big day," Dr. Aris said, stepping in from the hallway, sleeves rolled, clipboard in hand. He looked older than he had a month ago, but his smile was quiet, warm. "They're coming from Mesa. Family with 2 kids, big yard. They saw his picture on the adoption board." Raymond nodded, his expression steady though his chest tightened with every word. "He'll like that," he said, voice rough with restraint. "He deserves it." He turned back to the floor, pretending to scrub at a spot that wasn't there. The sound of tires crunching outside broke the stillness, followed by laughter, the kind that comes from people who haven't learned what it costs to lose. Through the window, he saw them. A young couple, maybe in their 30s, dressed in summer clothes. The man held a new red leash in his hand, the kind that caught sunlight like a promise. Beside him, a little girl with a wide-brimmed hat clutched a tennis ball, her face bright with excitement. They entered the clinic with the smell of road dust and hope. The woman smiled at the receptionist, her voice light. "We're here for Max." Raymond stood by the supply shelf, half in shadow, half in light. He didn't move when the doctor led them to the back. He could hear the familiar scratch of paws against concrete, the eager bark that used to mean mornings here. He told himself this was right. This was what healing meant. Letting go. When they brought Max out, the dog's fur glowed under the overhead light, his gait strong, his head high. The little girl laughed and knelt down, holding out the tennis ball. Max sniffed it, tilted his head, then looked up at the man who offered him the leash. The click of the clasp echoed louder than it should have. For a moment, everything stilled, the way it does before a storm decides which direction to move. Max's tail froze mid-swing, his ears pricked, his body rigid. The family waited, smiling, expecting joy to unfold easily. But instead, Max turned his head, not toward the open door, not toward the chuck grass or the promise of home, but down the hall, where Raymond stood still, hands buried deep in his pockets. Their eyes met, and in that gaze was the memory of heat and sand and cages and the sound of a voice that had refused to give up. Then Max pulled. Hard. The leash snapped from the man's grip, red nylon flashing through the air. In 2 strides he was gone from their reach, claws striking the tile in a rhythm that no one could stop. The family gasped. The leash trailed behind him like a streak of fire. He bolted down the hallway, ears back, a blur of muscle and instinct and devotion. Raymond barely had time to move before the weight of the dog hit him. Max pressed against his legs, tail thudding against the mop bucket until it rattled like applause. The man staggered back a step, stunned, staring down at the creature that refused to leave his side. Silence filled the clinic. The little girl's tennis ball rolled across the floor and came to rest beside them. Dr. Aris stood in the doorway, his face unreadable, his eyes glinting with something between pride and understanding. He walked forward slowly, resting a weathered hand on Raymond's shoulder. "Seems like he's already chosen," he said, voice quiet but sure. Raymond looked down. Max gazed up at him, ears perked, chest rising steady, mouth slightly open as if smiling. The red leash dangled uselessly from his collar. Something inside the man cracked wide open, not like breaking, but like light entering through old fractures. He sank to one knee, his calloused hand brushing the dog's muzzle. The laugh that escaped him sounded too much like a sob, too raw to be anything but real. "Then I choose him too," he whispered. The family said nothing. The woman's smile faltered, but it wasn't sadness. It was grace. She looked to Aris, who simply nodded. "He was never ours to give," the old man murmured. "Some bonds don't ask permission." Outside, the air shimmered with heat. The desert stretched endless, the same road that had once held a twisted metal crate now glowing beneath the morning blaze. Raymond stepped through the doorway, Max close at his side, paws clicking softly on the concrete. The leash hung loose in his hand, not as a tether, but as a reminder. The wind carried the scent of dust and sagebrush, the faint echo of tires far away, and the slow heartbeat of 2 souls that had already been lost once and found each other anyway. As they walked toward the light, the world seemed to open, wide, forgiving, alive. Raymond glanced down, his shadow merging with Max's as they crossed into the sun. No cages now, no orders, no running. Just 2 survivors on the same road, finally heading home. Some stories don't end when the mission does. They linger, in the spaces between footsteps, in the breath we take before saying goodbye. Maybe that's what loyalty really is, the quiet promise that refuses to fade, even when no one's watching. There are people in this world, men like Raymond, hearts like Max, who don't speak of bravery, yet live it every day. They fight battles no one will ever read about, keep watch in the silence after the noise has gone. And sometimes, their victories are small, a hand on fur, a heartbeat that refuses to quit. But they're the kind that keep the rest of us believing the world can still be kind. Kindness doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just waits, patient as morning light on an old road, until someone chooses to stop and look back. So if you ever find yourself on a quiet stretch of life, and you hear the faint echo of pause beside you, don't be afraid. It might just be life's way of reminding you, some hearts were made not to run away, but to walk beside us, all the way home.